Thanks, Rachel. One of the great preoccupations in this town over the past couple of years is trying to explain the recent behavior of the Chinese government, whether it's claims to South China Sea or its campaign against Nobel Prize for Liu Xiaobo, or the reluctance to let its currency appreciate. The question you keep hearing over and over again is what's gotten into China? And so the governing cliche now, along with the words that get usually used instead of a rising China or along with a rising China, is an assertive China. It's a fair question whether what we expected from China beforehand and how much of what we're seeing now is new, and maybe our panelists will address some of that. But the explanations you usually get tend to fall into three categories. One is that one involves national security. People say the PLA has gotten more influential within the government. Some involve economics. China's feeling its oats as a result of its relative strength in the financial crisis and after it, and some involve politics. China's worried about losing control, about an upsurge in dissent. So we have three panelists today who are going to address these issues. And Jackie Newmeyer, who will go first and talk about security issues. Jackie is president of the Long-Term Strategy Group. She's worked with the Defense Department's Office of Net Assessment on issues of Chinese security, and she's also senior fellow at Foreign Policy Research Institute. Jackie?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for coming. I think I have about 5 minutes to cover, I think I was told, political military developments in China and U.S. policy implications. So forgive me if I talk fast, but I just want to make 5 points. One, who runs China? Who are we talking about when we're talking about Chinese decision-making, Chinese foreign policy, Chinese security policy? Two, what is the nature of China's threat perceptions? What does the Chinese leadership fear? When they look out in the world, what are the threats that they identify? Three, what has the Chinese leadership been doing about it in the way of what is the nature of China's military capabilities? What do we mean when we talk about China's military buildup? Four, what is China's strategy? So what are the ideas guiding the defense modernization, the defense buildup? And five, what does this mean for the United States? And not just for the United States, because frankly, we should be thinking in terms of the impact of all of this, of China's rise on the region, not just on the United States. We have friends in the region, we have allies in the region, and we're there, we're present, we're an Asia-Pacific power. So we have an interest not just in what China does that affects us directly, but also what it does that affects our friends and allies. So first, who runs China? What do we mean when we talk about China doing this or that? I think we need to dispense with our American lenses for the moment and be frank about the fact that China remains a one-party dictatorship. The Chinese Communist Party runs China, not the government of China. We often read about the Chinese state, but in fact, it's the Chinese Communist Party that runs China. And you know this when you see that the Chinese Communist Party, and again, even if this isn't talked about or reported on as much, is behind the Chinese military, it's a party army, behind every Chinese firm, whether it's a state-owned enterprise or a nominally private entity. There's a Chinese Communist Party committee. The level of penetration of the Chinese party in terms of its surveillance apparatus exceeds the level of surveillance that existed in Stasi, East Germany, according to a recent leak from an internal security official in Inner Mongolia. So the party runs China, and to some extent, in some areas it's with a longer leash, in some areas it's with a shorter leash. There is obviously delegation of authority and distance between the center of China and the peripheral areas of China, but the Chinese Communist Party is what runs China, not the state, and it doesn't represent the interests of the Chinese people. Again, with American lenses, we tend to look at countries and their governments and think, these governments represent the interests of their people, or at least the votes of their people, the popular affirmation of their people. That's not the case in China. The Chinese Communist Party sees itself as guiding China and trying to provide, in the best of all possible worlds, the best outcomes for the Chinese people and to lift China into prosperity. Maybe that's imputing to them the best motives, but they're not elected. They are a select few. In a country of 1.3 billion people, we're talking of 75 million Chinese Communist Party members, and of that, really, it's a smaller group that's at the elite, that has the authority in China. And to be honest, I don't think we even know about the identities of all of the elites in the Chinese Communist Party, the select group that runs China. But if you want to look at the recent list of billionaires that came out in Asia and the number of billionaires in China, we know that the Communist Party is well represented on that list. So that's who runs China. Two, what do these people fear, and what are their threat perceptions, and what is China building up its military for? What's striking if you read their literature is the number of times you read about America, the United States, as a hegemon. And Chinese Communist Party army intellectuals, people who write for the Academy of Military Sciences and for the Chinese National Defense University, colonels, senior officers write about the U.S. as posing the biggest threat to China because the U.S. is the global hegemon, the hegemon of the world, and that really means something from a Chinese context because the formative moment, the founding moment in Chinese history was when the Qin warring state, in a period called the Warring States era, from 400 to 200 roughly BC, unified all China and became the dominant hegemon and launched China's long 2,000-year-plus dynastic era. So when China looks at the world today, it sees the U.S. as a hegemon, and it sees itself as surrounded by the U.S. And so it thinks that the U.S. is trying to extend its influence, conquer the world with its ideas of democracy and human rights and free markets, and it sees itself as being hemmed in by American naval presence and power in the Asia-Pacific region, and also by American friends and allies, from Japan to South Korea, around Southeast Asia to India, which is increasingly identified because it's a democracy and a friend of the United States as a zone of expanding American influence. When China looks at American behavior in the Middle East and Central Asia, it tends to see it through the prism of American hegemony, not as a discrete reaction to an event like 9/11, a terrorist attack, or a dictator like Saddam Hussein, but more as a campaign to project American influence and to expand in the world. So that's who runs China and what they fear, what their threat perception is. What have they been doing about it? Well, for the better part of the last 3 decades, China is engaged in a massive, very impressive, across the board defense modernization or buildup. And here it's tough to go into the details in less than 5 minutes, but you can see this at a time when a lot of other powers in the world were downsizing their military, or maybe privileging certain areas, like for the United States, counterinsurgency, but moving away from conventional power and conventional military rivalries. China's actually been expanding its navy. It's building all sorts of new destroyers and frigates and submarines at a very impressive, rapid clip. The Chinese, by most people's accounts, will soon have an aircraft carrier. They've already been present doing patrols in the South China Sea, in the Indian Ocean, some of it linked to piracy threats. But in general, China's economic growth has meant that it can see itself as having interests in a much wider sphere than just the Taiwan Strait, say. So the Chinese Navy is expanding and at least extending influence or presence in areas where it hasn't been. The Chinese land forces. I mean, China has boasts the biggest artillery force on the planet, I think, at this point, in terms of rockets and mortars, and you sort of wonder, what is all this about? The Chinese have been expanding in certain high-tech realms. They have 1,500 missiles, I think, across from the Taiwan Strait, according to the latest American defense estimate, but they're also building missiles that can target American carriers, so it's not just about Taiwan. They have dual-capable nuclear missiles stationed in Tibet, which gets the Indians' attention. They have conducted anti-satellite tests. They have built their own impressive over-the-horizon radar targeting capability that will help them use missiles precisely. They have obviously been very active in the cyber warfare, electronic warfare arena, and you hear things about this every once in a while in the press. Google certainly noticed. I could go on. They're modernizing their nuclear forces. They're moving to MIRVed missiles. We can come back to this in Q&A if people are interested in the details, but there's a very impressive, significant, expansive Chinese defense buildup that has been occurring since the late 80s. What is the strategy? Well, when this buildup was launched by Deng Xiaoping, the idea was, we're in a period, because of the decline of the Soviet Union, which had been China's actually rival towards the end of the Cold War, we're in a period, thanks to the demise of the Soviet Union, of kind of unique opportunity. While we're still scared of the United States and its democracy-promoting ways, We have an opportunity, because of relative peace in the world, to build up our economy and to build up our defenses and to take the best from America, which is I think from an American point of view, since the end of the Cold War, we basically approached China as a potential partner, an economic partner, as a state whose prosperity would help our prosperity and would eventually lead to a change in regime in China so that our political differences could be resolved. And I think Deng Xiaoping recognized that this was the American impulse, and his successors have been very happy to exploit American friendship and transfers of technology and investment. And there are good reasons for this, and in some ways the jury is still out. But it doesn't look like, at this point, that bet has paid off. It doesn't look like by making China richer, we've succeeded in democratizing China. As I said at the outset, the Chinese Communist Party still runs China, and as they see it, that's necessary. They view the Chinese people as potentially restive, as not being able to vote in their best interest. Some of these people aren't well educated. There's what they would consider the masses of peasants who pose a potential threat to the government in Beijing. So their strategy was, for a very long time under Deng Xiaoping's guidance, to bide time, lay low, build up their capabilities, exploit American economic cooperation and technology and Western technology transfer. Now it seems like they're moving away from that. I think people have read in the press about the recent dispute with Japan in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands dispute. There have been other brewing long-term conflicts over resources in the South China Sea. The border with India remains open, and just this week it came out that China has designated a new squad of Arunachal Pradesh scouts. That's the area of the border with India that's disputed. So all of a sudden we're seeing more assertive military behavior, revelations of new capabilities to the West, to other powers in the region, and it seems as though China is shifting from bide your time. So why, and this I have probably less than 30 seconds, why is China moving away from this, and why does it matter? I think we have to recognize that the Chinese Communist Party is in a very difficult position at the end of the day. As I mentioned, it's dramatically outnumbered by the Chinese people. Economic growth has been very impressive, and it's lifted many Chinese out of poverty. But at this point, with the second biggest economy in the world, it's very difficult to imagine how China can continue to grow at 8 to 10%. And I'm going to leave a lot of this to Derek, but I think there are demographic challenges, there are economic challenges, there are environmental challenges at this point as a result of China's growth and the devastation of the environment, pollution, water damage. So the Chinese leaders face a huge number of problems. And I think that they're more and more insecure, and I think that they are more and more fearful that they won't be able to deliver continued growth, and you're going to see them continue to behave more aggressively, more assertively in the region. And maybe it doesn't affect the U.S. Directly in the first instance, but it's something that we have to think about. And so, for my negative 2-second policy implication, we ought to be thinking about how to augment the defensive capabilities of our friends and partners in the region who are going to be in the firing line if Chinese leaders feel more and more stressed at home, and if they find the need to act more and more aggressively abroad to secure resources, to shore up their legitimacy.
Thank you. On economics, we have Derek Scissors, who is who's research fellow for economics at Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center, and also teaches a course on the Chinese economy at GW.
I'm going to try to talk faster than her. That's my challenge for today. I'm supposed to talk about China's global ambitions and their challenges, obviously from the economic lens. There's not a lot of time, as Jackie's pointed out, so I'm going to say a bunch of really provocative things and then claim that I don't have time to back them up, which is just perfect. But please ask questions, because I do like backing them up. The first thing on China's global economic ambitions, in response to Jim's prompt, there has been not very much change in China's global economic outlook over the last 15, 20 years, let's say, certainly 15. And that flies in the face of a lot of conventional wisdom, and what can I say? The conventional wisdom is wrong. China has and continues to want to operate in the U.S. economically, just talking about economics here, let's make that clear, in the U.S.-sponsored international economic system. The obvious sign of that is the desire for China to continue to peg the yuan to the dollar. And whenever you hear the Chinese saying they're depegging the yuan from the dollar, they're not telling the truth. They're not telling the truth because it would involve depegging. Actual depegging would involve the biggest foreign exchange risk of all time, because China holds so much of its reserves in terms of dollars. So the yuan is pegged to the dollar. The Chinese are stuck. It'll remain pegged to the dollar indefinitely. that is a sign that China wants to operate within the American economic system. Now, within that system, they want to, what we would call cheat, and what most countries would call act in their self-interest, which is push the rules of the system as much as they can. We do it sometimes. China does it more than most. There's certainly a mercantilist orientation in Beijing, notwithstanding the claims that China's not trying to run a trade surplus. Whenever I hear that, I always say, you're the most incompetent economic managers of all time. You're not trying to run a trade surplus, and yet you keep running the biggest trade surpluses in history. China's a mercantilist country. They want to operate within the US economic system. That was true 15 years ago. It's true now. There wasn't some big change about indigenous innovation. Indigenous innovation is a continuation of Chinese economic policy. It was labeled as such 8 years ago. It's not new. It's not different. If there's a change over time, it's that China, as Jackie mentioned, has gone more global in scope. It was a regional economy 15 years ago. It's now a global economy, which means that China's interests in market access, which were East Asia and the US, are now everywhere. They want to sell to everybody. They want to buy what they need from everybody. What they need is mostly primary product imports. The Heritage Foundation tracks Chinese outward investment, which is now a hot topic. We've been tracking it for a while. And you can see the patterns in Chinese investment. It's global. And so that's the big change. China doesn't want to replace the US system. It does not want to run the world economy by any stretch of the imagination, but it does have more global interest than it did 15 years ago, right? So that's the global interest. Now the challenges side, the second half of the equation. Now I'll also say something that's probably contra the conventional wisdom. Chinese economic challenges are increasing, not shrinking. The situation is becoming less positive, not more positive. And there's no problem imminent. I know some people are talking about property bubbles. It's all nonsense. But within the next 10 years, China's either going to have to undergo a sharp economic course change, or they're going to hit a wall. And I won't talk about the economic course change because it's hypothetical, but I'll talk about why they're going to hit a wall. This is really simple. Growth comes from land, labor, and capital. In the first half of Chinese reform, growth came mostly from land. It was allocating property rights to farmers, increases in agricultural productivity, and the ensuing changes from that. That is gone. Environmental devastation, political obstinacy, and allocating more rights. That leaves labor and capital. China has been blessed with a demographic expansion that India is now entering. They've handled it very well. There's some costs, but they've handled it very well. They've employed a lot of people pouring into the labor force. That has helped their growth. The demographic expansion is about 5 years from ending. So the quantity increase of labor is about to disappear. That means labor has to become more productive. Well, there's a big dispute about labor productivity in China, but it's pretty clear that increases in labor productivity have slowed. So they've lost land. They're going to lose quantity in labor. Productivity in labor is slowing. That leaves quantity of capital and productivity of capital. And what China has done for the past 7 years is spend tons and tons and tons of money. And you can do that for a while. We can do it for a while. And in a mixed economy, you can do it for longer than we can do it here. But the return on your capital investment declines, and that's what's happened to China. If you look at the ratio between how much investment and how much growth they have, and how much investment they have to have and how much growth they get out of it, it's clearly declining. So Chinese growth is essentially going away. It used to be based on land. It's not based on land anymore. The automatic labor contribution to growth is going to go away, and the capital contribution to growth is declining. This is just simple math. And we don't see it because people have a time horizon of 6 months. And when I go across the street to the Congress and say, China's got serious long-term economic problems, they say, well, long-term isn't next year, right? Then I don't care. So if you look past next year, if you look past the year after, there are serious and unavoidable long-term economic problems. Yes, China can change course and address those problems, but that's largely a function of political will. We have political will problems in this country. They have political will problems there, at least with regard to economic policy. So my story here is China is not trying to take over the world economically, and that's a good thing because if they did, they have significant economic challenges to overcome, and they're not on the right path to overcome them at the current time.
Thank you, Derek. Finally, we have on politics, democracy, and human rights, Carolyn Bartholomew, who's vice chairman of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and worked on China issues on Capitol Hill as counsel and chief of staff for Nancy Pelosi.
Thanks very much. Thanks you to the audience and to our panelists. I'll put in a pitch for the China Commission report because it addresses some of the issues that my colleagues up here have raised. Our annual report to Congress actually is being released on Wednesday, and we focus on a lot of the economic and security issues and the overlap between economic and security issues. So uscc.gov, you'll be able to get it on the website on Wednesday. But I've been asked to talk about something else, and while I can indeed talk as quickly as my colleagues, I think that I'd like to slow things down a little bit and provide some food for thought about why things like democracy and human rights matter. It's interesting to me that we don't have these kinds of panel discussions about the rise of India and what it might mean. There are indeed talks about that, but not in kind of the same way. And the rise of China brings with it a level of anxiety that I think that the rise of India or Brazil or some other countries doesn't exactly carry. It's also really easy for people to say that democracy and human rights, they're nice. But you know, we have these hardcore military issues we need to deal with. We have these hardcore economic issues we need to deal with. What does it matter to us if the Chinese are rounding up their own people, rounding up people who dissent and throwing them in jail? So I think we need to broaden our thinking about democracy and human rights, and I would argue that actually it underpins a lot of the concerns that show up in these other issues. Derek mentioned political will. Well, the people who have tried expressing their political will in China, who have dissented with what the interest of the Chinese Communist Party, as Jackie would say, have found themselves thrown in jail. We have had indeed conventional wisdom that's wrong, that economic reform would inevitably lead to political reform in China. Jim is the expert on that and has actually written a book about it. But really, these values of freedom and liberty that we talk about and human rights, they're the values on which our country was founded. They're also enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And frankly, it's not as though those of us who talk about democracy and human rights in China are arguing that it should become a Jeffersonian democracy. There are basic rights included in the Chinese Constitution, and the people of China are not allowed to enjoy those basic rights that are guaranteed to them by their founding documents. But our concern about how China treats its own people really needs to go way beyond that. As China is expanding its role in the global, on the global stage, it's exporting its own values, and they're the values of the Chinese Communist Party. So talk about this from the economic point of view. Access to information is really critically important. Access to accurate information in real time, critically important for business transaction. You cannot count on that happening in China. Rule of law, if you have a contract dispute with somebody, access to being able to get rule of law, and then if you make it through a court system, which is completely skewed, being able to collect on any judgment, also not guaranteed in China, a real problem that this takes place. And around the world, I think that there's an increase in a number of places, an increased interest in authoritarian capitalism, which is really what China is all about. And for people like me and others who have been interested in the developing world, interested in Africa, this increase in authoritarian capitalism and the idea that this is a successful model and one that should be emulated is of serious concern. There are a number of people, a number of organizations, the OECD, Millennium Challenge Corporation established by the Bush administration, that have been really focused on trying to ensure that development assistance is provided in a way that improves transparency and accountability in the countries where the development assistance is going, and that it helps build strong, solid governance. What the Chinese government is doing as it is going around the world acquiring access to resources which it needs to fuel its economic growth is it is providing assistance with no strings attached. So Robert Mugabe, he can get a new palace built with Chinese assistance. A lot of these deals that are taking place are deals that are going to solidify and empower people who don't have the interests of their own people in mind, and I think that frankly that's going to contribute to global instability in a number of places. So the Chinese exporting of their values through the way that they're doing development assistance is, as I said, undermining the OECD and US efforts to increase transparency. The Chinese government also is willing to step in and deal with pariah states in a way that makes it more difficult for the rest of the world to deal with those pariah states. Iran and Sudan are the two that I'm thinking of particularly. Censorship. There are so many things that are going on with censorship on the internet, for example. Google just today has released a new statement, and included in their statement, they've noted that more than 40 governments are engaging in broad-scale restriction of online information. That's a dramatic increase from about 10 years ago, and I would argue that it is because China has been doing it and doing it successfully that other countries believe that they can do so too. The promise of the internet was about the free flow of information. That's not how things are unwinding in a lot of places. Long arm of the Chinese censorship, as it's doing deals with countries, it's trying to influence how those countries are voting at the UN and in other bodies. And there are things, even they look relatively insignificant, but the Chinese government has been active here in the United States, going to communities that have wanted over the course of the past few years to pass resolutions in support of the Falun Gong and freedom of religion, or in support of the people of Tibet. And the Chinese embassy has intervened in this country and has managed to stop some of those things taking place. So this is not simply a matter of repression being restricted or limited to the 1.3 billion people of China. The Nobel Prize is a perfect example, and so far people are standing up on that. The Chinese government is so concerned and so upset about Liu Xiaobo having been awarded the Nobel Prize that they've gone to countries and told countries that they don't think that global leaders should be attending the ceremony in December. They even, apparently, though I'm not sure that this has actually been really proven, denied Miss Norway the crown for Miss World, supposedly out of reported petulance about the fact that Norway indeed was the place that granted the Nobel Prize. And then finally, if nothing else convinces you, every day we can pick up the newspaper, just about every day, and see some sort of article about something that's going on with China. And I noticed this one, well, this is from Thursday of last week. China jails man for activism after the tainted milk scandal. What's happening, of course, is that a lot of times the only way we find out about problems with products that are being produced in China and sometimes being exported is because there are people who are brave enough in China to stand up and to try to take action about that. But the Chinese government isn't interested in that happening. The FDA has a presence in China. It's nowhere near big enough. It's nowhere near able to deal with all of these exports. And if people who try to stand up and talk about tainted products are being shut down, the likelihood of those products being exported to the United States and causing damage here really increases. So there are reasons on a number of levels why we should be concerned about democracy and human rights. And I'll finish right there.
All right. I want to leave a good part of the rest of the time for your questions, see what's on your mind, what you're thinking. So we do have a microphone, right? Good. We've got one right here.
My name is Shayna Taylor. I'm with the Washington Center. And my question is, China is currently using a lot of soft power tactics around the world to extend its influence, as some of you briefly brought up. And in your opinion, how dangerous of a threat does this pose for U.S. interests?
Jackie, you want to
Sure. I think it's a combination of soft power and real power, first of all. So it's largesse to dictators, it's building palaces or building hotels or barracks for the militaries in one-party states in Africa or other parts of the world. It's being complicit in arms transfers. Sometimes, North Korean deals in the Middle East have involved overflight rights from China. So there are proliferation elements to this. And it's actually active arms transfers, too. So it's not just a question of influence and soft power, which obviously matters in terms of the values that people think it's okay to embrace or the way that people run their own countries. It's their hard capabilities that are changing as a result of Chinese, for instance, anti-ship missiles arriving in places like Iran, or sophisticated munitions that end up being used against American soldiers in Afghanistan.
But Jackie, I think of that as hard power.
Right. I'm saying there's a
why
combination.
Why should we be threatened by soft power? That's an open question, right?
Well, I think that they go together. It's not, I mean, if it were just soft power and it didn't, if you could really neatly draw a line between sort of a charm campaign that involved buying off one-party state leaders, dictators in certain parts of the world, and just say that, then you would be dealing with devastating blows to our efforts to promote human rights and democracy. But it doesn't stop there, because the same government that accommodates or supports a one-party regime also makes it militarily stronger and supports its defense acquisitions. So we're dealing with a much blurrier line than just soft power or hard power. It's influence, and it's spreading one-party dictatorship kinds of values, but it's also empowering rogue regimes, or however you want to label them, with the means to acquire sophisticated weapons and surveillance apparatuses. So I think, as Caroline mentioned, the one-party authoritarian capitalism model is attractive to a lot of states, including Iran, that want to build up their economies and enable their leaders to stay in control. And China actually has techniques. There's a science to Chinese surveillance and internet filtering and censorship. And there is some evidence that Chinese delegations go to places around the world where China has friends, and teach the governments how to do the kind of monitoring that China does, that ends up enabling the Chinese government to suppress dissidents, crack down on human rights defenders. So it should be of interest to us for not just soft power reasons or human rights reasons, but also military reasons, and the intersection of the two matters.
Derek, Carolyn, what do you think of this?
Well, I think it's an important question about the use of soft power, and I think there might be different layers to it, one of which is China's use of soft power in countries in the region itself, and then China's use of soft power elsewhere in the world. All countries engage in diplomacy of some sorts, and it's not as though we should expect that the Chinese government doesn't. I think it certainly argues for the U.S. to increase its engagement elsewhere in the world, and would commend President Obama for having gone to Asia now. It sends an important message to the Indians. It sends an important message to the Indonesians, and it sends a message, I don't even want to get Derek started, to the Koreans, so there are issues having to do with regional things, but it's very interesting. If you look at the region, there is a growing concern in Southeast Asia about China's rise. So even as it's exercising its soft power, there's a growing interest in the U.S. being engaged. And I want to use, for example, Vietnam, which has, the Chinese have been on a charm offensive in Southeast Asia, but the Vietnamese are very concerned both about China's interests in the South China Sea, and they're very concerned about the upstream damming of the Mekong River, which has significant consequences for Vietnam's economic growth and its ability, frankly, to serve as a breadbasket for a number of other countries. So I think what's happening with China's soft power growth is it's happening, but it is not allaying the concerns that other countries have. If you look in Latin America even, and in some places in Africa, there are people in countries that are concerned that China's presence and its acquisition of resources is actually just a new form of colonialism. And what's happening is the Chinese government is coming in, the Chinese companies are coming in, they're buying resources, they're building bridges and railroads to get to those resources, but often they aren't even hiring local people in order to build the projects or do the work, and people in countries are concerned that what's happening is what they have of value is being scooped up and taken away. So I think it's about balance, that both the balance that many countries are aware that the Chinese government is saying one thing and doing another, and also the balance that we need to be more engaged to ensure that in terms of diplomacy, the values that we believe are important are also represented.
Next, let's see. Back there. Okay.
She has no idea where she's
Yeah.
Winston Wilkinson from Johns Hopkins SAIS. One question, you mentioned that you don't envision China as taking over the global economy, but if you envision that there's 350 million people within China's middle class, and if you envision that class becomes anything like the US consumer economy, I guess you could say that at some point, China's grab for resources will force it to take over the economy. So what are your thoughts on that? And second, what do you say to the argument for people who say that China could not have progressed as far as it has under a under a democratic form of government in terms of economic progress? There are human rights abuses, but they would argue that obviously they wouldn't have advances as far as it has.
All right, I'll answer the first one and start to answer the second one. It leaves my area of expertise to some extent. Chinese resource demand is an important factor in the global economy. It's becoming a more important factor. That is part of their expansion out of the region and into the globe. I don't think having high resource demand constitutes taking over the global economy. If it did, then a lot of people in the U.S. would be less concerned about U.S. oil dependence. I mean, the Chinese see it as a dependence problem. They have to ensure supply, and it's a big challenge. It's not an economic advantage. With regard to the sort of, it's a mistake to talk about the Chinese middle class, not because that there isn't one, but because it evokes this idea that the Chinese middle class is like the American middle class. Actually, the Chinese middle class makes, 1/5 the amount of money the American middle class makes. It's not the same thing. So when we're talking about growth of a Chinese middle class and Chinese demand and its effect on the global economy, it's just a qualitatively and quantitatively different thing than what the United States does now. Now, if you project Chinese growth far enough in the future, I have colleagues who do this. Well, they grew for 30 years, and so we'll just do this for another 90 years, and look at this huge number we get. That's absurd, and that gets back to your second question in a second. Then you can get these big effects. And if China manages its economy properly, it has major obstacles to overcome, but then it will become larger than the U.S., not as rich, but larger, and be one of the two and possibly 3 or 4 stewards of the global economy. But the resource demand, which is extremely intense, does not constitute taking over the global economy, and the Chinese middle class is decades away from having the effects that people ascribe to it. With regard to development, politics is not my thing. Good policies work, bad policies don't work. South Korea developed, North Korea didn't develop. Is that a sign that South Korea should revert away from a democratic system? Obviously not. It's not. China's politics did not change in November 1978. Right? It was a Communist Party dictatorship, and it was still a Communist Party dictatorship. They changed their policies. Policies are what determine successful economic development. Now, if you want to go ahead and say it's easier in an authoritarian context to enact certain policies, maybe. That's beyond my area of expertise. But what I will tell you is, it's not an accident that most of the world's poorest countries are also dictatorships. So policies are what matter. The political setting for those policies, I think that the evidence is mixed. But if someone wants to tell a complicated political story, it's beyond my pay grade.
Can I just one follow-up is we do have other models of states that have enjoyed rapid growth or in the process of enjoying rapid growth that aren't one-party dictatorships. And India comes to mind. A lot of people thought that India would never be able to achieve the economic growth that it's already achieved or in the process of achieving. And it's a democracy, and it's complicated, and it's messy, and it's different. I mean, the Indian economic model seems to involve growth based on services, and the Chinese model up to this point has involved growth based on exports. And as Derek explained, the sources of that growth look like they've been exhausted. So you can even make an argument that the very smart policies in the short term that the Chinese adopted to enjoy the growth that they've enjoyed to date are actually going to make it difficult for them to make a transition and continue to grow because, again, as he mentioned, they enjoyed growth because they moved people from less productive rural areas into urban areas where they could work in factories and they were more productive. At the same time, they had a one-child policy that meant that there were fewer people to make that transition and to make up the labor force in the future, and there are fewer people left at the countryside. They've moved them into the cities and the urban areas, and the growth has been export-led, and now we're in a world where there's going to be potentially less demand from the rest of the world for Chinese exports. So what the Western economists say is China needs to develop domestic consumption economy. But at this point, they've exhausted the resources that they had in their people. They've stopped investing in healthcare. They've stopped investing in education. People don't feel like they can spend a lot of money. They don't have a social safety net. So the source of growth that we prescribe for them for the future in a domestic consumption economy isn't really likely to materialize. So you could almost say that the sources of growth that have made China grow this far, this fast, condemn China to have slower growth in the future.
Carolyn, thoughts on this?
Yeah, there's a lot embedded in that question. I think first I'd say that on the economic progress that it wouldn't have happened under a different political situation. I think that's kind of a post hoc rationalization, and indeed it is true that China has been able to do much of its growth because it's got a centralized economy and also because it's got an industrial policy. But you can be a democracy and have an industrial policy also. There might be people who would disagree with me up here. I want to counter one thing where I disagree with Derek. Another place where I disagree with Derek is I think that the issue of I'm not as sanguine as he is about China's what China's economic rise means for the global economy, and frankly, I focus more on what it means for the U.S. economy. But I think when you look at resource demand, it's going to be a source of significant competition. It already is, and it very well could become a source of conflict. I think if you just look at the example of what has happened with rare earth minerals over the course of the past couple of months, some of us actually started talking about rare earth minerals back when the CNOOC deal was about to happen. I was very concerned that Unocal at the time controlled the last remaining U.S. source of rare earth minerals, and people poo-pooed us and said, oh, please, you're being ridiculous. You're overreacting. But we can see that the Chinese are more than willing to use access to resources that other people would normally be able to get on an open marketplace in order to achieve ends that it wants is a really serious concern. I think there are huge issues relating to water that are going to come up over the course of the next 10 years. But when you talk about any resources, you talk about oil, you talk about copper, you talk about any of the basic resources, and then you add in water. And I think that the resource challenge is a place that the global economies are going to have to learn to work together. And I'm not convinced that the Chinese government is interested in doing that.
Okay, right here in front.
Hi, my name's Steve Scarano. I was wondering if China was investing in resources in the Middle East, and if so, how that would affect U.S. influence and operations there.
If you go to type into Google China Global Investment Tracker, you'll get very exact answers to your questions. China is, in fact, not investing very much in the Middle East, and that may surprise some people. You're not allowed to invest a lot in the Middle East because the national governments own the oil assets. What they're doing instead is engaged in a lot of very large equipment and construction projects. And it's a smart alternative way to win influence in the area. Middle Eastern economies are resource-rich and labor-poor. China is happy to provide Chinese labor. In fact, that causes friction elsewhere in the world. So we know how to build highways. We know how to build chemical plants. We'll come in and build them for you. We'll subsidize financing for part of it, even though the Middle Eastern economies don't need any money. We're your friend. And it's an expansion of Chinese influence, not through investment, but through something similar, these contracts. Is that a challenge to the U.S.? I mean, we definitely have I'm the odd person out on this panel. We're not used to having another global economy, and this gets to your question. The Soviet Union was not a global economy. It's not even a functional economy. It certainly wasn't a global economy. China is a genuinely global economy. We're not used to that. We're not used to the idea that someone might be buying more oil on world markets than we are. So in that sense, it is an adjustment. It's going to be an adjustment for American policy, and there's an adjustment, that's twinged by the fact that the Chinese are clearly mercantilist in their behavior, and we're not used to that at a global scale. We're used to that at a regional scale either. So there's an adjustment to be made for the U.S. I think where I would depart from the rest of the group is, if China's building chemical plants for Arab countries or other energy providers like Iran and Kazakhstan, where China is in fact investing a great deal, although I wouldn't count those as the Middle East. Then that's okay. That's what we try to do. That's what we have tried to do. I mean, they're behaving in a reasonable commercial fashion. They're making bilateral deals with governments. We may not like the governments. We make big deals with governments we shouldn't like either. So it's not like China's behavior in the area is much different from America's behavior. And in fact, the Chinese, of course, will tell you, well, we don't have 150,000 troops on the ground, so it is a little different. It is going to be an adjustment. It's something that U.S. policy has to adjust to. I just don't see anything wrong with it. I see other things wrong with Chinese policy. Their involvement in the Middle East is not one of them.
Jackie?
I mean, I think there's involvement, and then there's arms transfers, and there's development of dual use or dual capable port facilities that have naval implications. So I think that it's not all commercial what's going on in the Middle East, and the Chinese realize that they have a problem with their energy dependence on external sources, and they realize that the Middle East in particular is a volatile region. So they've been trying to reduce their dependence on the Middle East, but they retain a significant investment in Iran, they have one of the 5 oil fields. They're one of the 5 winning bids for oil fields in Iraq. They've done deals with the Saudis. They're increasing presence there. They're trying to transition, or they have begun to transition to more reliance on Angola and places in Africa. But again, the dependence on energy supplies from foreign sources creates a potential vulnerability in the minds of the Chinese, who think of themselves as surrounded by an American hegemon. So they use the energy dependence as a pretext, or it justifies in their mind naval expansion, the need to have Chinese vessels to protect shipments of oil coming back to the mainland. And so we're dealing with an expansion in Chinese military power, not just commercial power. And as Derek mentioned, they're mercantilists. They have a different outlook. And I think it's funny to justify China's behavior on the grounds that it's what we do, because we're different from China. You know, we have a liberal regime. We make mistakes all the time, and we've had, you know, there have been things in our history for which we need to apologize and have apologized. But at the end of the day, we think of ourselves as trying to promote human rights and lift all boats and prosperity, and that's not how the Chinese regime thinks of itself. It thinks of itself as in a dangerous world surrounded by a hegemon, facing a potentially restive population who don't deserve, who have no basic right to democracy or human rights.
Next, we've probably got time for 2 or 3 more. Way at the back.
Hi, I'm Brennan Paroli, and my question is mainly for Mr. Zinsser. You mentioned that Chinese labor is
Scissor?
He means me.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Derek, easier.
Gotcha. Well, could you speak a little more on the details of that? Because it seems to be, there's a lot, you hear, oh, you know, this issue with the Foxconn factory, and you hear bits and pieces here and there. But could you maybe speak a little bit more on how China's labor impulse and improvement rate is decreasing and why that's happening?
I understand the question is, why is increases in China's labor productivity, why they would be declining?
Yeah.
And you know, this gets a little bit technical, but this basic answer involves low-hanging fruit. Essentially, what you were doing as Jackie referred to earlier, and I referred to before that, when you're taking people, when you increase agricultural productivity in miraculous fashion, although not surprising considering where they started, in the 80s. So you needed a lot fewer people working on the farms. This is the challenge India has now, by the way. You take those people off the farm, so agricultural productivity is soaring because of the initial set of reforms. And then you take these people who were accomplishing nothing on the farms before. Product output goes up when they leave. So they were just stuck there. And you move them into factories, right? You get this massive increase in labor productivity. So, you know, what you've had over the beginning part of Chinese reform, and not just the beginning, the first few years, let's say the first 20, 25 years of Chinese reform, the bulk of Chinese reform is an easy way to get huge increases in labor productivity. It's not, you know, if it were easy, everyone would do it. I mean, the Indians are struggling with it. But the point is, okay, let's say it wasn't easy. The Chinese accomplished this wonderful increase in labor productivity. That was the stuff that didn't require that many hard decisions. Or if there were hard decisions, Deng Xiaoping was there to make them. Now, you need an education system that actually works at higher education level. China already doesn't need secondary education. It's got that. You know, the Indians need secondary education, the Chinese don't. They need higher education. Well, the higher education system is absolutely rampant with fraud. And it's not it's not mass production. You can't just say, you know, we want more engineering graduates and they will all be skilled. It doesn't work that way. There's a quality element that isn't as easy to mandate from Beijing, although there are a lot of orders to that effect. With regard to manufacturing, China will naturally move up the manufacturing scale, so there'll be some increases in labor productivity that way. But you don't have the transformative, it's just not available. This is part of China being a more advanced economy than it was. The transformative increases in labor productivity that China saw in the first 20 years are not available anymore. The end, they're not. You can do a better job or a worse job, but you can't recreate those. So naturally, the contribution of labor productivity to growth is going to decline. And this is, I'll just wrap up, because I know this is boring for 90% of the people here. As economies get richer, capital becomes more important, investment becomes more important. It's not exclusive to China, it's just true. One of the few exceptions is us, because we have so much of a land endowment that we haven't used and we allow a lot of immigration. But China's naturally going to become more dependent on capital. It's not a function they've done something wrong, it's just normal. The way that they're investing is terrible. That's the mistake. It's not a labor productivity mistake. The labor productivity evolution is natural. The investment now is larger and larger state firms, more and more government-controlled investment. When people talk about rebalancing, I'll finish on this. When people talk about rebalancing in the global economy and how China is so unbalanced, 7 years ago, China wasn't unbalanced. 7 years ago, consumption was larger than investment. It hasn't been a problem that occurred, from the beginning or because it was a command economy. It's because the Chinese have gone insane on investment. They've driven down, as a result, because so much state mobilization of resources, they've driven down their capital returns. So thanks for the corrective. Labor productivity is naturally declining because of success. That puts more burden on capital, and that's where the Chinese failure is.
Okay, I'm going to take one more right here on the aisle, in the middle. We have to wrap up around 3, so.
Hi, my name is Ryan London from George Mason School of Public Policy. Two-part question. One is, since we have a huge budget deficit in the United States, I was wondering if one of you guys can talk about how the United States can compete against China continually with in terms of military weapons and things in the South China Sea or other areas throughout the world. And also, in addition, if the United States can, for some reason, because of budget deficits, do you think Japan will modernize and go against their constitution and expand?
Okay, I think you will get the gist of the question. The idea that the United States can't compete with the defense budget is larger than China and a zillion other countries. But you know the spirit of the question.
Right.
Jackie?
I think we all face limits and constraints, including the Chinese, and as we've just been discussing, their economic growth can't continue at the rates that it has enjoyed in the last decade or two. The United States has a huge number of advantages. We have a lot of friends in the region. We have years of, I don't know if you want to call it practice or a head start in a lot of very sophisticated operations that require not just like the latest technology, but people who are experienced in using them. I guess the engineering term would be tacit knowledge and systems knowledge. You need to understand how complicated things go together. And the Chinese have obviously been working very hard in a number of military areas and made very impressive strides. But at the end of the day, they're a newer, younger force. They have issues with the education level of their officers and their enlisted people in particular. They have a relatively new NCO corps. So in a lot of military areas, the U.S. Has a lot of advantages just from our history and our starting position. That said, if you look at the rates of construction and investment, the U.S. military has been extremely preoccupied with our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And our Asian friends are looking around and saying, a Japanese friend showed me a graph. He was a fellow at Harvard last year, and he said, look, these are the trends in Chinese shipbuilding, and these are the trends in U.S. naval presence in the region. What are you going to do about it? How can you reassure us? And it's up to us. We need to work with them. It's not all about the United States, but to maintain a balance in the face of China's rise, serious U.S. commitment to the region, supporting friends, building up ourselves will be necessary.
Derek, impact of the deficit. Let's put aside the military part. But
The impact of the deficit. I could go on a long spiel about this. To me, the deficit is the #1 threat to U.S. national security. I don't think in the short term, so I'm not a conflict-oriented person. We have every advantage over the Chinese in all sorts of economic ways, and the main way China catches up to the U.S. or threatens the United States in some global sense is we shoot ourselves in the foot. The main way we're shooting ourselves in the foot right now is the deficit. But with regard to the military budget, it's not my area. I'll pass.
Carolyn?
Yeah.
Last words?
Yes. Well, first, I think dealing with the deficit and making sure that we have a strong national security, strong military, it's going to be a matter of making priorities and doing investment, frankly. I also believe we need to be investing in the American people. But I would say for the 20 years that I've been working on U.S.-China policy, there's been a policy fight going on about what China is and what China will be. And the Department of Defense, people in the Department of Defense even were often going along with everything is going to be okay. I certainly hope that China's rise turns out to be peaceful, but I think it's irresponsible for a military to decide that it is going to be peaceful. I think that we need to be prepared in case China's rise isn't peaceful. For a number of years, people kept saying, well, we can't treat the Chinese like they're an enemy because then they'll become an enemy, which I think is a foolish argument. I would argue that what we need to do is strengthen our relationships with countries in the region, as Jackie has said, invest in our national defense in a smart way, invest in our economic growth in a smart way, and be prepared in case things don't turn out the way we would like them to. Thanks.
Good. I think that's a place to end it. We've got to end it by 3. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the panelists.